friends. I'm doing a mic test, among other things. Yes, I can slowly hear my voice. So if people can please take a seat, and we'll make a start. And welcome to all those who are joining us on the live stream. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for all of you who are in the room this evening. My name, as I think most of you know, is Ian Markham. I'm the Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce the Associate Dean of Multicultural Ministries, the Reverend Dr. Joseph Thompson. But before I do that, I just want to frame this moment for just a second. It's interesting. We live in a season where everything is polarized, and it's exhausting in so many ways. But So You're Clear, marking the commemoration, has been part of Virginia Theological Seminary all the way through my tenure. And for those of you who don't know, that's 17 years. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very touched. So, and predates me by at least a decade. So this is not, this is just regular gospel work. This is thinking a little bit about what Paul writes to the church in Galatia. There's neither bond, neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond, neither male nor female, neither bond nor free. We're all one in Christ Jesus. This is just fundamental gospel work. And I invite us always to frame these conversations in the language of our tradition, in the language of the faith that we affirm, in the gospel that we are witnessing to, in that obligation to anticipate a kingdom that is promised and made possible through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what we're doing here. And other ways of characterizing occasions such as this, we need to push back on. This is not anything other than regular fundamental discipleship work. So with those preliminaries, I ask you please to give a very warm welcome to my good friend and distinguished colleague, the Reverend Dr. Joseph Thompson.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. So I have taught, I believe, the first book of our keynote speaker, The Death of Race, Building a New Christianity in a Racial World, a number of times in my teaching career, because I find it to be the kind of book that you can go to again and again and always find new insights. And what Brian Bantam manages to do in that book is to personalize stories about race without sacrificing the analysis of race as a system, as a structure. And in fact, he beautifully weaves those different strands together. And so last August, I was a guest lecturer in the Foundations for Ministry course taught at that time by Dr. Kimball and Dr. DeGaynor. And I quoted The Death of Race at the end of my presentation. And after class was over, Dr. DeGaynor approached me and she said, well, you know, I know Brian Bantam. So if you would ever be interested in having him come to speak, I could probably hook you up with that. So I said, that would be fantastic. And so she got on it right away, emailed Dr. Bantam, and apparently they really do like each other because he agreed to come and speak here. And so I'm very grateful to have colleagues who know people that I would like to get to know and to hear more from. And I'm certain that after this evening, we will all be very glad that we heard more from Dr. Brian Bantam. But because Dr. DeGaynor knows Brian, I invited her to introduce our speaker tonight. So at this time, would you please welcome Dr. Liz DeGaynor, Assistant Professor of Practical Theology and Christian Formation.
Well, that's nice. Thanks, y'all. Good evening. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Brian Bantam. I first met Brian when we overlapped as graduate students at Duke Divinity School way back when. We're not counting those years. He was finishing his doctoral program as I was starting my master's degree. And along the way, we had the opportunity to learn from and to teach with folks like J. Cameron Carter and Willie Jennings and Amy Laura Hall. I vividly remember him precepting for my first course on Christian ethics, because I had done graduate work in English literature before, so this was new theology for me. And he showed us how to attend to Pecola Breedlove, a character from Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, a character upon whose body the gaze and weight of the world is focally brought to rest, while the Jesus of a wall painting looks on with, quote, sad and unsurprised eyes. I still use his whiteboard illustration when I teach the text, but I don't draw nearly as well. Dr. Bantam is a theologian, and he approaches this vocation with a systematic and constructive emphasis, considering how Christians have wrestled to speak of the God they encounter as they make sense of their world. Our mutual friend, Amy Victoria Adkins Jones, Assistant Professor of Theology and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College, notes her appreciation for Brian's mode of doing theology. Quote, he explores it from a lived and a living place, in the mess and with the messy, noticing the gritty and the gorgeous, attending to the here and the there and the in-between. He speaks from a lofty pulpit, but also as a fellow sojourner along the way. He invites us to do the work together. Brian Bantam is a prolific writer. He's a contributor and editor for the Christian Century. He's the author of Redeeming Mulatto, A Theology of Race and Christian Hybridity. He's the author of The Death of Race that Joe Thompson noted, and as the sort of inciting event for inviting him here to this event tonight. And he's the co-author with his spouse, Reverend Gail Song Bantam, of Choosing Us, Marriage and Mutual Flourishing in a World of Difference. And perhaps my favorite, Brian is a teacher, both as the Neil F. and Isla A. Professor of Theology at Garrett Evangelical Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, and as theologian in residence and part of the preaching team at Quest Church in Seattle, Washington. One of my VTS colleagues had Brian as a facilitator at the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning, and Sean Strout noticed that he offered, quote, a holistic approach to theological education, seeking to care for the whole person with humor and creativity, unquote. And it's true. Brian engages fully with heart and body and mind and soul, and he invites others to do the same. Brian says that he has always been drawn to questions about identity, especially about the ways racial imagination shapes our identity, and how our lives as disciples might instead live into the fullness of God's life, becoming slight glimmers of God's present and coming kingdom. May it be so. Tonight, he's going to wonder with us, who will we be? Identity in a splintered world. So let us give Dr. Brian Bantam a warm welcome and the space to speak into our community. Grateful for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeGaynor. I'm going to need a copy of that later so that I can put it on my board and remind myself of who other people think I am sometimes when I don't believe it. but I am sincerely thankful for that introduction and for your friendship and for facilitating this invitation, for Dr. Thompson for reaching out, and for this community and your hospitality while I have been here. As Dr. DeGaynor mentioned, the title of my talk is Who Will We Be? Identity in a Splintered World. And so I'm honored and particular to be a part of this event, recalling Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy as a pastor and a theologian who earnestly believed and lived as though God mattered for our everyday lives. This is also a particularly meaningful experience or moment for me because it was actually King's life and work that drew me to theological work as an undergrad. I still remember sitting on the floor in the stacks of the library reading his letters and his sermons, accounts of his life and his work, seeing a way to braid together critical engagement with a cultural, political moment and theological insight, and then living into those beliefs and those commitments. In many ways, I was following the breadcrumbs of his words, and that led me to theology, and continues to shape why I believe theology matters for us today. I'm also thankful to be home, in a sense. I actually grew up on the other side of the Potomac in Germantown, Maryland. Back when it was a far-flung little development in the middle of pastures and farmland. Back when you had to drive all the way to Gaithersburg to go to the local A&P to get groceries. My mother would always take us to the neighboring knick-knack store, and if I was really lucky, she would let us get a Matchbox car to take home with us. Now, I don't feel that old, but even thinking about my life here just 30 years ago, I'm reminded of just how inevitable change is. And how that change, as imperceptible and subtle in the moment, is always pressing on us. Something like gravity, an unseen reality, a force of nature that simply is. And our bodies and our muscles and our bone density are all woven and formed by that pull of Earth's mass. Only looking back on large swaths of time that's passed do we begin to understand just how much our life, our world, our communities have changed. At the same time, it seems to me that these swaths of time necessary to perceive change have grown shorter and shorter. I'm not sure if anybody else feels that necessarily. But maybe the change in press, we feel it more acutely. But I wonder if this is part of the swell of nationalism and toxic masculinity and xenophobia and LGBTQIA hatred and. That somehow in the midst of all of these changes and the shortening ebb of the waves that crash on us, people feel the pillars of who they are, of who they thought they were, begin to slowly crumble, if they really existed at all. And they cling ever more violently to the ideas and beliefs and myths where they somehow made the most sense, that help them make sense of this disequilibrium they feel in this new world of climate uncertainty, of ever-expanding identities of sex and gender, of the increasing presence of difference in their lives, in their neighborhoods, or on their screens. And regardless of whether we feel these changes in the slow creep of climbing waters or surges like tsunamis, we undoubtedly feel the violence, both of the ground shifting under our feet and the clamor of bodies fighting to get to higher ground. Now, part of what I think is so important in commemorating the murder of one of our saints is to understand clearly just how far people will go to protect the story they've told themselves and the life that they've built upon those stories. As people of faith, we cannot escape the question that confronts us in the face of this violence. Who will we be? And if we are honest, it is a question that feels harder and harder to answer. In the midst of shifting demographics, of shrinking churches, of differences that feel like they are multiplying exponentially, even as the crises that face us feel more and more intractable, and the consequences more and more stark. So in the face of this, we have a decision to make. Whose story will we attend to? Whose story will we allow ourselves to be grafted into? I say this because it seems to me that one way of responding to the parade of dire news and political machinations and seeming loss of prestige and power and centrality in communal life is to lament and wonder what happened. To ask, what can we do to regain trust, to make amends, to somehow return to this place that where we thought we made the most sense. But of course, underneath that hope is also a certain measure of belief in the certainty, a belief in the stability, a belief in the inevitability that held American Christianity in particular together. Or one could say what grounded the centrality of Christianity in American life was a question of which Christianity was true, right, most genuinely American. And so we could dialogue and worry and debate about our doctrines and our practices and our prayer. But underneath the surface of imperial Christianity, there were already any number of expressions of the holy, of the divine, of the true, the good, the beautiful, burning through cracks and climbing walls and turning towards whatever slivers of light they could find. In other words, the difference that we are so afraid of is not new. It is just apparent. It is unafraid. It is inevitable. So when I became more immersed in Dr. King's story and in the Christianity that he was formed in, a Christianity that boycotted papers and organized strikes and created mutual aid, even while speaking to the individual needs and laments of everyday people, I began to see a Christianity that told a different story about what we were and what we might be. A story that did not shy away from the complexities of who we are and the society that we live in. And before I go on too much further, I should also say that the story of King's Church, of the Black church more broadly, is not a universal story. That is, it is not a story without its own attempts to paint singularity in the midst of its own multiplicity. That it was not a place that preached freedom for all in the streets, but also tried to silence women and queer folk within its walls. There is no panacea, there is no myth, there is no perfection that we can point to, right? So what happens when the stories that we have that are available to us are always broken, always messy in some ways? As Emily Towns writes, defining Black people's otherness as subjectivity, as victimization, is a hollow and incomplete description of isness. We have narratives of resistance and rebellion as part of our story as well. Yet we must not rush too quickly to celebrate the victory of our diversity, end quote. But I suppose that's the point. Is the story we tell a story that needs to silence? Is it a story that needs singularity? Is it a story that needs uniformity in order to maintain its faithfulness? One of the things that the Black church and Black faith pressed into me was the possibility that our whole selves were made in the image of God. That this complexity could mean fear and joy and rage and hope and despair and individual accountability and systemic critique and knowing and not knowing and making mistakes and maybe even admitting that there is knowledge and wisdom that isn't gleaned from within these hallowed halls. I guess the question I want to ask us tonight is, what might a different story begin to look like? a story that might allow us to account for this world of difference and change in a new way, a story that might allow us, free us, in fact, from trying to overcome and fight against singularity and empire and universality without having to create our own norms of universality and singularity. Is there a different way of thinking about this, of living into this? And so we might begin to tell this story not with an account, maybe, of God's omnipotence or God's providence or rationality or unity. What if actually the heart of Christianity is actually the presence and the possibility of difference? A God who is unseen becomes flesh. Who is God if we believe in the incarnation of the eternal Word? That which we thought was fundamentally contrary to flesh, yet now identifies with flesh. What if we tell the story of creation not as of order and progression, but actually difference being pulled out and created and multiplied again and again and again, in such a way that there is no whole without the many? Not a question of who rules over the many. What if we speak about a God who walked and talked and ate and suffered? What does this mean for our bodies, our relations? People who were deemed defiled now become siblings and mothers and fathers. What are the marks of faithfulness in someone's life, in a community's life? What is Christian identity and the theological reflection that emerges from these communities? It is maybe perhaps an ongoing negotiation of what our bodies mean in relationship to God and to one another. Who is in? What does inclusion look like? What does it mean to say that Christian faith inevitably means that my body is bound up and tied to yours? So theology as a practice emerges from these questions and the answers that have been given over time. Now, while theology as a practice can be understood as reflection upon and expression of who God is, of who we are and what is the world that we inhabit, theology should also be considered an act of identity. That is, theology emerges from the interplay of who people believe themselves to be in the midst of their descriptions of God and the world. And through confession and differentiation, theology identifies its internal structures, its boundaries, the names and signs of belonging. And this has always been the case from the very beginning. Whether Justin Martyr's appeal to philosophy or Irenaeus' rebuttal of those described as Gnostics, to violent and enduring anti-Semitism, theological description emerges from an attempt to account for oneself in the world, or account for the differences among us. Put differently, theology as an act of identity begins with the presupposition that there are no words from God that we utter, that all of the things that we talk about in terms of who God is emerges from the resources and the grammar that is available to us in this moment, which means it is always limited. It is always contingent. It is always malleable, right? There is no perfect word. There is no divine theological truth that if we dig deep enough, we can pull out the box, open it, and say, look, this is what we really meant. So what if theology is always grounded, rooted in our flesh and the limitations of our fleshed life? So the ideas of race, of gender, of sexuality, of nation, ethnicity, the belief in the intrinsic meaning and value of who people are based on physical characteristics is all also an iteration of this dynamic of identity. So in a way, what we're have to work with is that theology is not apart from who we understand ourselves to be, right? But is always an expression of who we think we are. And then our understanding of who God is drawn from what we think we are. And those are always pinging off of one another all of the time, right? There is no first order, second order. They are always reciprocating, bouncing, and meshed in one another. So what if we understood Christian identity to be no different than any other identity in how it unfolds and how it negotiates the world? Put differently, what if there was a time when we were not, so to speak? What I mean is what if we begin with the presupposition that everything that we describe in this world, there was a time when it was not described that way? When our words kind of, in a sense, come out of us, emerge out of this goop and evolve and change over time, and then we try to divinize them as though we did not ourselves evolve from nothing. So we need a way to understand the complexity of our Christian identity with the myriad identities that constitute who we are. One of the problems that's plagued Christianity from its very beginning was the "and" problem. The problem of duality in some cases. But that is to say, how can you be a Christian and a Roman and a Jew and? And we repeat this problem over and over and over again, somehow trying to pretend as though we can find the exclusion that somehow will mark our belonging. But we can't. The "and" problem is a problem created through the presumption of identities as fixed, as something that required something to be excised or removed in order for the new thing to be occupied or claimed. Behold, the old has passed away and the new has come into being. Except thereto you are the same you, right? You come out of the baptismal waters, a new creature, except you kind of look like the old creature. But so much of our Christian life is built on, and our theology is built on the presupposition that we really are something different. And that we have to struggle to find, excise, cut out, refuse all of those pieces of us that somehow are so far against and contrary to what we think God is, that ultimately what we have to do is hate ourselves in order to love God. But what if there is a different way of thinking about identity? Not as singular, not as fixed, not as stable. For theorist Stuart Hall, identity is not the assertion of a certain stable point of personhood. Rather, he writes, quote, identity refers to the meeting point, the point of suture between, on the one hand, the discourses and practices which attempt to interpolate or speak to us or hail us into place as the social subjects of particular discourses. And on the other hand, the processes which produce subjectivities, which construct us as subjects, which can be spoken, end quote. He goes on to suggest that identity is better understood as, quote unquote, identification, an ongoing dynamic process where individuals and communities are negotiating who they are and who they are not through a complex circuit of representative signs, patterns of production and consumption, everything from food to tools to cars to homes to music, and means of disciplining those who transgress those boundaries of how identity is construed in any given moment. The particular configuration and movement of these forces create a web of shared meaning that constitute a particular culture or subculture. For Hall, this dynamic of culture and identity is what constitutes culture. Culture is not a thing. It is a process. It is an ongoing unfolding. that is kind of spreading and pushing, that is constituted by many cultural realities inside of it, even as those get blobbed together and then separate again. And this is what we are constantly a part of, all of the time. Right? And so, but even as there are, in all of these norms that we think that create the sense of this is what happens when I get off. I get all excited and I look up. Just trust the words, Brian. Just trust the words. So within all of these systems, there are competing forces of power and discipline and resistance. Everyone is navigating these dynamics of power that function as the seemingly normal or natural way of being. These norms have a history, but they are obscured by the presumption of their eternal or seemingly natural or divinely ordered origins. Even as there are norms and those whose identity is braided in the maintenance of those norms, there are also those whose identities have been narrated as other, as the antithesis of the norm. For those whose marginality creates the center, they are navigating their identities either in approximation to power or articulating their personhood in opposition to the hegemony that attempts to determine the meaning of their bodies. And in more likelihood, there's actually multiple of these realities happening in every single person at one time. So on the one hand, I stand here before you as a very tall man. People generally do not mess with me. But I also stand here as a black man, which means that some people will mess with me. I stand here as a man, as a cis hetero man, which means that there are a whole number of things that I do not have to navigate, that are presumed that I can live into. I have a tremendous amount of freedom. At the same time, I stand before you as a neurodivergent person, which means I am also constantly suppressing certain inclinations that I have to navigate the world. And we are all of these complicated, messy realities, all of the time, right? And part of the kind of lure of the singular narrative is that we have to somehow lift one of these out, to either articulate our marginalization or to understand our power. But in fact, all of these things are moving and acting within us. So these dynamics of identity emerge in all of these social interactions and claims of peoplehood, and then become the formative lens that people live into or resist in complicated and often overlapping ways. And so identity as a process has two implications for any consideration of our lives as disciples. First, Christianity is not exempt from the dynamics of identification. In fact, its very beginnings exemplify the very kind of suturing that Hall speaks of. Christian identity is an ongoing process that is navigating belonging and exclusion in relationship to the first Jewish followers of Jesus, to the broader, varied Jewish community, to dynamics of class and power involved in navigating the Roman Empire, and the myriad peoples and movements and philosophies and religions and dynamics of gender that constituted the Roman Empire. And so while race as we understand it today was not an operative term in early Christian communities, there were nonetheless dynamics of power, differentiation, of negotiations, of what being a follower of Jesus would look like. And so as Christianity distinguished itself from its Jewish beginnings, Jewishness no longer served as a mark of likeness or kinship, but as a negation. Some would believe they superseded Jews as Christian belief came into the world. Theologian Willie James Jennings points to this critical break in identification with Jesus' Jewishness and Jews as a people of God as the nascent moments of racial imagination. The relationship between modern conceptions of race and Christianity's understanding of itself in relationship to Jesus' Jewishness and the Jewish people cannot be overstated. Even prior to colonial expansion, anti-Semitism in Europe was the central axis of violent differentiation, and what scholars such as Geraldine Heng and Matthew Vernon argue are even the earlier moments of the European racial imagination. And so throughout its existence, Christian life has been a problem of identity. Who belongs? Who is outside? Who is kin? In a way, Christian identity exemplifies this very suturing and ever unfolding that Stuart Hall describes, and such that in our identification with the Word, who becomes flesh, we are drawn into identification with one another. An identification that is not fixed, but fluid and constantly being renegotiated as we continue to meet others who are drawn into Christ's life. But as we know, this was not the story of Christianity. In the biblical accounts of life with Jesus, the earliest followers of Jesus struggled to comprehend the transgressions of identity in the confusions of belonging of Jesus' struggle, of Jesus' life. Even while they walked with Jesus, the disciples bristled at the associations Jesus drew them into. And even after Jesus' death, we would see stark lines of exclusion and belonging emerge. These dynamics of identity are not exclusive to Christian life. They are intrinsic to every community and every individual. And at the same time, we have to trace the formations of these claims and how they shape our faith in our community. A study of theology and identity is an examination of how the negotiation of identity and Christian faith, Christian life, both creates logics of exclusion and belonging, as well as might find a new way of understanding who God is and what our human lives mean. And so I wonder, though, what happens when our lives as Christians are not dominated by narratives of what we are not, or what we cannot be, but rather discipleship might become an ongoing recognition of the complicated tethers and threads and braids of belonging and exclusion, of complicity with power and subjugation and silencing, that our lives are always, in fact, tied up in these complicated realities, not necessarily because we are good or evil, faithful or unfaithful, but rather because we are human beings bound up in time. I often wonder with my students if the true original sin in the Garden of Eden was the actual eating of the fruit, or actually the denial of one another's humanity when confronted by God. This makes a big difference, right, in how we tell the story and what we think Christian discipleship might look like. Imagine how different the story would be if the fall wasn't about breaking a rule and stealing from God and the necessity of punishment. But instead, what if the story of the fall was the way that we barred ourselves from communion with God by denying the imago Dei in the one that we were pulled from, and the ground that we were formed from? What if the story we told about our beginnings were not stories of immortality and never dying, but the reality of death in the created world, and its inevitability and its beauty and the need for that death in order for life to flourish? Think about this. What if death in the Garden of Eden was the point? And we struggle and we tell this story somehow to protect ourselves from this thing that actually is necessary and beautiful and what God calls good. How does the story change that we tell ourselves? Is it possible that what if the story about our beginnings wasn't stories about immortality and never dying, but what if there was such a thing as a good death? Not a like macho, I'm going to die to protect everyone. Not that kind of good death. I mean the good death that is uneventful, where you are 80 or 90 or 100 and surrounded by your friends, surrounded by your adopted children, surrounded by the things that you made, the world, the house that you made. And everyone is sitting around holding on to you, and you feel their breath and their warmth even as you pass on your last breath, knowing that in all of these people, in all of these creatures, in this very house, you in fact will continue to live forever. What if death isn't something that we needed to kill someone else to avoid for ourselves? What if the whole of Christian life was not existing along a duality of a mortal life and eternal damnation, but the possibility of good lives and good deaths, and how we might continue to exist in this world in the lives of those that we love? I wonder if we need to first recognize the part of the crisis has to do with just how successful Christianity's story has been. That is, how successful a story grounded in the belief in winners and losers, of saved and unsaved, of heathens and saints, of insider and outsider. There are those who know and those who do not know. That's an easy story to tell. It's an easy story to get others to believe. It's an easy story to gather people around and justify the killing and the exclusion and the murder and the rape of others. It's so easy. And Christianity, I think we have to say, told it well. But what if the story of the Word enfleshed was not a story actually of certainty, but a continuation of God's story with us, which is actually a constant cycle of identification and differentiation, of being with in such a way that always requires us to rethink who we are and who we ought to be. And it is that very imbalance, that syncopation, that actually shapes our community. But I have to be honest. I do not have a tremendous amount of faith that a Christianity shaped by presumptions of difference and multiplicity and identification will push back the seas or temper the violence of people who so easily see some lives as disposable. I do not have a magic theological bullet that somehow could shift our politics or fill our pews. But there is something that I do believe. Something that I believe Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Emily Towns and Audre Lorde and Stuart Hall and Mercy Odioye and my own spouse, Reverend Gail Song Bantam, have taught me. That if we discount the small, seemingly innocuous spaces that have created space and flourishing and home and safety for some, we have missed the heart, the sacramental nature of Christian life, that when you create a space of flourishing for two or more, there I am. We may not fill cathedrals, but where two or three are held in God's love in all of their particularity and in their peculiarity and all their difference, I believe the eternal breaks into time. And if we truly believe in the hegemony and the ubiquity of evil in this world, we should also celebrate and point to the miracles of any moment that refuses the march of evil in this world. After studying and teaching particularly on issues of race and the social and structural realities of violence, I have to be really honest, I have become less clear on how to move forward. I just have to be real. In all honesty, the last 5 to 7 years have broken my brain. I used to think, oh, if people only knew the history. I used to think, oh, if people only understood Jesus in these kinds of ways, that somehow we would find a way. But somehow the power of these other stories takes all of those great histories and those new words and those new theologies and twists them into a kind of rhetoric and a kind of propaganda that is then used to bludgeon me. But in the remains of all of these tattered, of the battering, of those kind of ripped to shreds, I still believe that there is something beautiful. That my church community in Seattle, Washington, that is a community that tries to hold together multiplicity and inclusion. In the midst of all of this kind of the ubiquity of violence and the rhetoric of power coming from the White House, there were Instagram live dance parties and images and songs. And even in the midst of all of the hand-wringing, there was also a sense, at least with a few folk, that we were in this together. And that when we looked at one another, we reminded each other of the possibility of life in this world. And so this has coincided with a longer journey that I've been on to live into my own artistic sensibilities, to be mentored into the life and craft of making. And what do I mean by how these are connected? What I've begun to realize is as I've lived into the art and the craft of creation, of making, of artistry, I have also begun to realize what I had missed in my theological education. A theological education of analysis, of classification, of critique, of pointing out who didn't read who. What I began to realize, what that education did not give me, was the possibility of putting something beautiful into the world. And so I've begun to wonder if we have not missed something when we overlook the artists in our midst. I don't mean that we overlook what they create. What I mean is, what do we lose when we miss how they see and feel the world? How they know and how they speak to what they discover. So as we're closing here, I want to read just a few passages from one of my favorite writers right now, Ross Gay. And this comes from a book called Inciting Joy. This particular section is the 9th incitement. He calls it the ninth incitement, pickup basketball. And he's talking about the joys and the peculiarity of pickup basketball. And if you'll bear with me, I want to read a little bit. It's going to be a little bit of a lengthy thing, but I hope you'll understand where we're going with this. He says, "All birds sing, but maybe early birds the loudest, or it seems that anyway. Especially when the early birds are mostly black across from the fancy condos, down the street from Whole Foods, soon to be the Amazon, playing a game whose song is loud and brash and consoling and flaunting and flouncy and tender and cackling and profoundly unsingular, endlessly emergent, schools in the kingdom, practicing for an elsewhere we are in the midst of by practicing it. Practicing the elsewhere we imagine. Pickup is an elsewhere, I'm saying, whose logics, by which I really mean practices, grown up with and by Black people, though not exclusively, don't misunderstand me, refuse ownership and the owners, refuse settling and the settler, refuse the very conditions by which we became Black or white or whatever in the first place, because those conditions are the end of our time here on earth. Which raucous birdsong mustn't disturb the dreams of those who think they can own the world. For even their dreams must be guarded against trespass, maybe their dreams especially, and as such must be dealt with swiftly and to the fullest extent, which means on a court, in a school of elsewhere, in the kingdom of joy, they had to take the rims down, which means once again, we would have to find each other elsewhere. Meet you there. So in reading Ross's account of basketball courts and the elsewhere places that get created on them, I want to leave you with two questions. First, what might it look like for our churches to be glimmers of these elsewhere places? And is it possible to read Scripture, to read the stories of God's movement with us as a near constant call to become these spaces? Obviously, I think they might be. And if we are to do this, we may need to embrace a different way of doing our theological work, discovering different and oftentimes undulating patterns of belonging in Scripture. That maybe doing Christian life might even feel a little bit more nomadic and sporadic than cathedrals and church buildings. But part of what I also want to leave you with in Gay's words are the possibility of a different way of doing theology that does not circulate around critique and deconstruction. What if we critiqued by what we created? What I mean by this is, what if we followed the craft and calling of artists that required us to put something into the world that spoke, that revealed, that cut? But we cannot get away with simply repeating what others have said. What if the Christian life is an artist's life? And like good artists, we cannot simply say the same thing over and over and over again. We must look attentively to a world that is always changing and find ourselves within it. And in doing so, we create enclaves whose rhythms and sensibilities and aesthetics prick and prod and point us to elsewhere places. Now, I realize that as I've gotten to the end of this, I have perhaps not spoken as much about race, about white supremacy, about violence or reparations, as maybe some had expected. Or have I? Peace and thank you.
Dr. Bantam has agreed to take some questions. And so, of course, we will, as usual, have myself and Reggie running around with the microphone because, again, we are live streaming, so we want to make sure that questions are heard in the online environment. But I will open the floor now for questions. Thomas.
Professor, thank you so much for this. I want to follow up with your comments about 5-7 years ago, you thought differently than some of what you were reflecting on tonight. And I'm wondering if you could say some about how your sense of teaching theology has changed along that change you've experienced in yourself and your hopes for this country, for the church, and so on.
Yeah. So to give a bit of context, I have kind of two primary teaching contexts. One was I taught for 10 years in an undergraduate institution, and predominantly evangelical, but it was in Seattle, so the students were a very wide swath of folks. And in the last 5 years, I've been teaching at a seminary, a standalone seminary. And I think part of what I found in the midst of teaching was just how difficult it was to try to convince people of something once a word lost its meaning, right? So like I know that there's a formal word for it, right? Where like you say a word so often, then all of a sudden it just kind of like it almost kind of is like unintelligible. So in the midst of kind of BLM in particular, but even in the rise of Trump, there. Like all of these words, like all of a sudden they were getting all of this traction and like you had this moment like, oh wait, this is it, right? White people are gonna get it. This is gonna happen. Look at all the streets. And then all of a sudden it just like all evaporates because all of a sudden the words just completely like lost their meaning, right? Because they had gotten repeated so much. And then of course they get repeated so much that then those in the opposition, right, take it up and all of a sudden wokeism is a bad word, right? So in the face of all of that, what I began to realize was that you could not try to argue through a kind of more precise language to help someone see. That in fact, probably the most disruptive thing that you could do is actually make space for other people. Make space for the people for whom you wanted to protect, for whom you wanted to flourish, right? So in some ways, like the way that I engaged most directly those I was opposed to, the more power I gave to them. And they were perfectly happy for me to argue with them because they were not going to change their minds. And they understood that because whether or not they could or they couldn't, I mean, there are lots of reasons that we could talk about it. But when I turned away from them and I cultivated a place of safety for 3-4 students, when I created a kind of alternative community, when we started having a kind of place where we felt safe, that is actually when I understood the threat to be most dire. Because all of a sudden they recognized that I didn't need them. I didn't need them for joy, I didn't need them for hope, I didn't need them even maybe for certain monetary realities. And so the more that, and there are a number of different ways of doing this. There are ways of doing this that are very practical and community organizing, and I'm not really a community organizing kind of person, so I didn't do that. But you do create language, or you create beautiful things that people can gather around, that all of a sudden open up people's eyes to a different possibility. And the more that happens, I truly believe that something that is a miraculous reality. Because I really do think the evil in this world wants to flood us, right? And so any moment that we can create and craft together a little lifeboat, I think is miraculous. And it pisses people off too, oddly. I hope that gets at it.
Hello, Professor Panchum. My name is Rode Molla. I teach here at BTS, and I just want to say thank you for your work first. I used your work for my dissertation. I wrote about in-betweenness, and mainly my ideas came from your work, so thank you so much for your work. So my question is about just the image you shared about being an artist and being a theologian, and like giving less emphasis for deconstruction and decolonizing work. So I think that the work you did today and the work you have been doing is decolonizing in many ways, because that's what I got from your work. So I think theological reflection, as you mentioned, is a continuous reflection. It's not something now I'm an artist and I'm not gonna do that part. So I'm afraid about the staticness, thinking, okay, theological education is doing theology, is construction. You know, I'm an artist and I'm constructing something good about possibilities and beingness. Doesn't mean like I'm not doing that, like the deconstruction part. So I just want you to reflect on that. So in that way, I can be able to see the holisticness there.
Yeah. So if you walk with artists, in any way, I think we sometimes have an image of artists as just overtaken by the muse and they just create stuff, right? But if you go to any artist studio, what you will see are not only like sketches and drawings, depending on what their discipline is, but you will see works, you'll see books of philosophy, you'll see books of social theory, you'll see histories. And so part of what I think so oftentimes people miss about artists is that they are profoundly curious about how the world works, and also have a deep, profound understanding of how systems shape and mold us. And so their interventions, their artistic interventions are not just, oh, I'm just gonna make something beautiful, right? Those are actually the product of very careful study, of very careful reading of history, of research that is always kind of sitting underneath the surface of whatever it is that we actually see. Now, and so I guess part of my hope is that I think that there are two different ways of doing theological education. I think there's one way of doing theological education that says you need to read everybody that has said X, Y, Z. and then you just kind of leave it there so that you can show that you know, right? But there's another way of thinking about theological education, which I've been thinking more and more along the lines of an MFA, which is to say you read everything that's been written, or you read these particular ways of reading, but so that you can write something yourself. And in some ways, the extent to which that novel, like, so if I were in an MFA program and I write a novel, and say it's like, so I write it, my hero is Toni Morrison, and I basically write The Bluest Eye 2, I will have failed, right? Because really what I did is I just reproduced someone else's work and research. But in fact, if I write a novel that takes my own experiences in these and is in conversation with them, but ultimately has to put something new into the world that is not always explicit, but nonetheless does work. That's the sense that I mean. So it's not without analysis, not without deconstruction, but the deconstruction isn't the end of the work.
I'm looking to this side of the room. Is there anybody on this? Well, I'm just making sure there's nobody over here. But nobody. Oh.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about how we have a common language in Scripture and that it so quickly becomes stale. And yet we return to these exact same words over and over again to try to express our story. And I was wondering if there are any methods of imparting freshness to Scripture that you employ in your own life, in your own spiritual life, that you might share with us.
Yeah, I think this is very much, for me, preaching is very much a kind of artistic practice in the sense that whenever I enter into Scripture, obviously you have history and you have the historical criticism and you have the word studies, but whenever there's like things like rocks or dirt or a road or a tunic or mud, or even like a tone, right? What happens for me is like always the entry point is, what is it that the entirety of that picture is beginning to do? And how do rocks or roads or shapes or tones, how have I heard those in other people? And so all of a sudden, for me, what Scripture becomes is a kind of ringing inside of my own life and the experiences of the people that I love and walk and notice and observe. And then all of a sudden, what becomes true in that moment kind of begins to emerge. And the reality is it's always different because there are always different sounds echoing in any given moment when I return to that word that allows me to attend to something in a different kind of way. So whenever I'm reading Scripture, I'm almost always thinking about like, what did the air feel like? Or what did the tree smell like in that moment? Or what did the sun feel like in that moment? And then that's the beginning of my reflection.
Anybody on this side of the room? Okay. Then we'll go back to that side of the room. Kimberly.
Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I have a sense that artistic expression has always been a part of your life. Am I correct in that? Mm-hmm. Or okay. So there is a beautiful connection between theater theory and practice and what we do in the church. And when you speak about creating art and people getting together and collaborating and using each other's gifts, there is a tremendous parallel between that and what we want to do as church. Is this something that you've thought about, and could you perhaps speak to it a bit?
So I have not thought about the theater, although a good friend of mine, Shannon Craig O'Snell, does a lot of work around this. And so I would defer to her wisdom. I'm a little bit more of a solitary creature, so sometimes collaboration is not where I would begin in terms of artistic endeavors. But I will say that all of my children are are artists as well. And I think part of my joy is seeing them live into that fully early. Whereas I was an artistic person and then got saved, and therefore that was not a viable way of, that's not what faithfulness or call looked like. And so I was like, okay, I need to be faithful to this call. So I studied history, went to divinity school and theology, and it wasn't until 20 years later that the poetry kind of like found me again. But for my kids, what I found is they live this life. And so in a way, like it's not so much always collaboration, but it is attending to what one another are creating. And what that awakens in us and opens up possibilities for in us. And I think that that's absolutely that. Yeah.
I think if there's time for one more question. Anybody?
So it's not a question, but about the artist part, I know, for example, like I think for me, art is, we can use art to reframe also. Like there is an artist I know in Ethiopia, I'm from Ethiopia originally, and she is using art to reframe how Ethiopians were painted. In the Ethiopian context, there are so many images of how Ethiopians were portrayed. So right, how she's using art is to reframe that, to deconstruct how Ethiopians were portrayed. So I think that sometimes there is a need to deconstruct, to reframe, but it doesn't mean like I'm not constructing. Mm-hmm. I can construct something beautiful, and I can do something that's creative, but in that work, I think there is a possibility, or there is a need to deconstruct, to reframe. So I think like, art and being artist is not always constructing, like creating something to construct for the sake of. It could be also deconstructing and reframing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And my sense is always reading the Gospels that this is the exact work that Jesus is doing, right? It's not a first order, second order. He is simultaneously deconstructing even as he is creating new communities. Right? And that's the very sensibility of artists that I mean. Yeah.
Well, it is clear that you have stimulated a lot of rich thought amongst us tonight. And so could we please give a round of applause to... Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.